Welcome to Affinity Designer. In this video, I'll show you how constraints can be used to aid website design. Constraints control how a child object behaves when you resize its parent object. Therefore, this feature can be used to show how web content will display when a web browser's window is resized. If you've not worked with constraints in Affinity Designer before, I recommend first taking a look at the Constraints Overview video, accessed via tutorials, or the Help topics. Click Affinity Designer Help. So let's dive straight in with the design we've got on screen, which shows an artboard, our container, which contains a header, footer and hero, the nested content. When designing for web, the artboard acts as the viewport. With Lock Children switched on, when we resize the artboard, we see a non-responsive fixed web design. This is not ideal. I'm going to undo my resizing by selecting Undo from the Edit menu. I'll actually be undoing quite a few actions during this video, so I'll make a note of its keyboard shortcut for future use. The shortcut will differ depending on your operating system. With Lock Children switched off, when we resize the artboard wider or narrower, you'll see each element gets wider and narrower with the artboard. If this happened with a real website, it would look horrific. So this is where constraints come in handy. All constraints behavior is controlled via the Constraints panel, which can be displayed by going to the View menu, accessing the Studio submenu, and selecting Constraints. The Constraints panel will update depending on which object is selected in the Layers panel. So, if I select the header, the inner square on the Constraints panel represents the header, and the outer square represents the artboard. The header currently resizes with the artboard. This is shown by the scaling arrows displaying as solid white. If I click on the arrows, they switch to display as dashed and grey. This means the header no longer changes size when I change the vertical size of the artboard. However, it does move away from the top of the artboard, which is not ideal. Let's fix this by selecting the header again and selecting the top anchor line on the Constraints panel. And you'll see that's much better. Ideally, I would like my header to adapt to the artboard's width, as this white space looks a little odd. There are two ways I can do this once I've reselected the header. I can either reinstate horizontal scaling by clicking this arrow, or I can anchor it to the left and the right, which will force it to scale anyway, which is what the dashed white scaling arrow indicates. The advantage of the second scenario is that if we were to copy the header to another artboard, say one representing the website on an iPhone, the header will immediately constrain to the iPhone's width. We want the footer to act in a similar way to the header, but have it anchored to the bottom. So this gives us an opportunity to recap. Select the footer, then on the Constraints panel, disable scaling. Set the bottom anchor, and then set the side anchors. You may notice that when the artboard is made taller, white space appears. This is where additional content would appear. However, when the artboard is made shorter, the footer appears to resize. This isn't actually the case. The footer is simply being hidden by the hero, because the hero is higher up in the stacking order. Before we move on to looking at the hero, let's first solve the issue of the logos and the menu icons stretching when the artboard resizes. On the Layers panel, expand the header item and select the menu icons group. As we've moved down one level, the parent-child relationship represented in the constraints panel has changed. The selected item, i.e. the menu icon group, is the new nested content, and the new container is the header. Now, when we adjust the settings in the constraints panel, anchoring it to the top right and removing scaling, they are applied to this menu icon group relative to the header. The same goes for the logo, which we'll set to be anchored top left and non-scaling. When we resize the header, the contents conform to the constraints we set. Of course, if we resize the artboard, the header resizes and the contents inside react to this in the way we set in the constraints panel. For a comparison, see how the logo on the footer has stretched, but the one on the header has not. We'll set this logo so it's pinned to the bottom of the footer and does not scale. So now let's turn our attention to the hero. We need to concentrate on how the hero reacts to the artboard, but the hero's contents can be quite distracting, so we'll temporarily hide them all. The hero expands horizontally with the artboard, but we'll change it to use anchoring for the same reasons we did for the header and footer. Next, we want to prevent this white space appearing between the header and the hero when the artboard is made taller. We can anchor the hero to the top of the artboard. It will now always stay that distance away from the top of the artboard, and because the header never stretches vertically, we'll never get white space at the top. However, we have got a situation where if the artboard height is increased, the hero's height increases. If this was a browser window, I'd want the extra room to reveal more content rather than increase the hero's height. So this is the maximum height that I want my hero to be, regardless of the size of the artboard. This is where min-fit control comes into play. When we select this, the hero's height will not increase beyond the current design if the artboard is made taller, but it will shrink if necessary if the artboard is made smaller in both directions. Actually, I need to clarify that the height of the hero will actually still increase in height in certain situations. The first is if the artboard is resized while retaining its aspect ratio. The second is if the hero's width has increased. The height might later increase until it arrives at the same aspect ratio it was when min-fit was set. Then it will stop increasing. This is because min-fit and max-fit will honour the aspect ratio of the content where possible. Now we understand all about constraints, let's put our knowledge to the test by displaying the hero's contents again and deciding how we want them to react as the hero changes size. We want the background image to scale with the hero, never lose its aspect ratio, and always fill the entire space in the hero. So keep the scaling arrows active and switch on max fit. The same goes for the logo and the foreground image. The nameplate should scale and keep its aspect ratio, but we don't want it getting particularly bigger, so let's set this to min fit. The arrows are perfect the size they are and we don't want them scaling, but we do want to anchor the right one to the right and the left one to the left. Now, when we resize the artboard, it all works perfectly. And if you want to see what the design looks like on a smartphone, such as the iPhone 6 Plus, just add another artboard to the design and copy the content across. And it still all looks perfect. Once you've finished the full design and implemented constraints throughout, the AF design file becomes a blueprint for a web developer to get the final website functioning correctly. I hope this tutorial has given you an idea of the ways in which you can use constraints for web design, or at least giving you enough information for you to begin experimenting with the constraints panel for yourself. Thanks for watching.